She thought it was just another ordinary flight, nothing more than a chance to rest, close her eyes, and escape the noise of the world. But as she drifted into sleep, thousands of feet above the ground, something was about to happen that no passenger could have prepared for. Moments later, the calm hum of the engines was shattered when the captain's trembling voice echoed through the cabin. Passengers froze. Fear spread like wildfire. And in the center of it all was her, the woman who had only wanted peace, now caught in the middle of a storm she never saw coming. What happened next was not just terrifying, it pulled back the curtain on a hidden truth, a truth about race, power, and survival in a place where justice should never be questioned. Why was she singled out? Why did the captain's words change everything? And how did this single moment expose a reality the world still struggles to face? This is her story. It started out as a day no different from any other. For her, airports had always carried a strange mixture of chaos and comfort, the rush of footsteps echoing through wide hallways, the blur of voices in dozens of languages, the rhythmic announcements calling strangers to distant places. She blended into it all seamlessly, just one more traveler with her boarding pass tucked neatly in hand. Nothing about her presence suggested the storm that was about to unfold. Her name didn't matter to most people who passed her. To them, she was just another passenger, quiet, polite, and easy to overlook. But beneath the surface lay years of struggle. Years of learning how to smile through prejudice, how to keep moving forward even when doors closed unfairly, how to prove herself over and over in a world that often refused to see her worth. She had grown up knowing what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers had doubted her abilities, bosses had dismissed her potential, and strangers had made assumptions before she even spoke a word. Yet through it all, she had fought to rise. She earned her degree, built a career, and carved out a life defined not by limitations but by perseverance. Still, the weight of constantly having to prove she belonged never truly went away. It lingered in every glance, every doubt, every unspoken judgment. On this day, though, none of that mattered. At least, that's what she told herself. She was flying not for work, not for obligation, but for a rare chance to breathe. It had been weeks of long nights and endless responsibilities, and for once, she allowed herself to believe this trip might bring peace. Just a quiet flight, a few hours to close her eyes, and a chance to feel invisible in the best way possible, not ignored, not dismissed, but free. She moved down the aisle of the plane, her bag resting heavy on her shoulder. Around her, passengers jostled for space, some impatient, some already frustrated before the journey even began. She ignored it all, choosing instead to focus on the small relief of finally finding her seat. Sliding into the window spot, she exhaled slowly, as if releasing weeks of tension in one long breath. The hum of engines outside was steady, calming, a promise of escape. As the plane filled, she watched fragments of other lives shuffle past, families settling children, business travelers opening laptops, couples leaning in close to whisper. It was a reminder that everyone carried their own story, their own reason for being here. For her, it was simple, to rest, to reset, to reclaim a little piece of herself. The flight attendants moved briskly through the aisle, their practiced smiles masking exhaustion. Overhead bins slammed shut, safety instructions echoed, and soon the cabin dimmed into that familiar half-light of departure. She leaned against the cool glass, eyelids heavy, surrendering to the rare comfort of stillness. For the first time in days, she slept. But even in sleep, a truth lingered, one she could never fully escape. Because no matter how successful she became, no matter how quietly she moved through the world, her presence was never neutral. In rooms where she should have been welcomed, she was questioned. In spaces where she should have been invisible, she was noticed in all the wrong ways. She had learned to live with it, but not to accept it. And as the plane climbed higher into the sky, the stage was quietly being set for a moment that would test just how deeply those truths ran. The calm of the cabin was fragile, a thin veil stretched over something unseen. Somewhere beyond her closed eyes, a problem was forming, one that had nothing to do with her, yet would soon draw her into its center. Passengers shifted uneasily, a few exchanged nervous glances, but for now, silence held. She couldn't know it then, but the peace she so desperately craved was already slipping away. In just moments, the ordinary rhythm of a routine flight would be broken. A voice would rise over the intercom, unsteady, urgent, and in that instant, everything would change. She would no longer be just another traveler. She would become a target of attention, a symbol of fear, and a reminder of the painful reality that even in the safest of places, prejudice can find a way to surface. And when that moment came, every eye in the cabin would turn toward her. What started as an ordinary flight was already transforming into something else, a stage on which old fears and unspoken biases would collide with terrifying urgency. She had come on board searching for peace. What she would find instead was a moment that would expose not only her vulnerability, but also the fragile truths the world still struggles to confront. Because sometimes, racism does not appear with warning. Sometimes it waits silently, disguising itself in authority, in protocol, in fear, and when it emerges, it changes everything. And for her, that change was only minutes away. The cabin was still. The faint hum of engines filled the silence, steady and soothing, masking the tension that was about to erupt. She stirred lightly in her sleep, unaware that the calm she had finally found was seconds from being shattered. Then it came. The intercom crackled, followed by the captain's voice, tight, unsteady, carrying a weight that silenced even the restless children. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone already laced with urgency, "we are in a developing situation. If there is anyone on board with military or fighter pilot training, please, identify yourself immediately." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. The words themselves were enough to ignite fear. Fighter pilot training? On a commercial flight? What could possibly require that? Passengers shifted nervously in their seats, eyes darting from one row to the next, searching for someone, anyone, who might stand. And yet, in that heavy pause, it wasn't the unknown threat that drew the most attention, it was her. She had been asleep, her head resting gently against the window, a picture of calm. But now, as murmurs spread, faces turned toward her with a sharpness she could feel even before opening her eyes. Suspicion hung in the air, subtle but unmistakable. In moments, she went from invisible to center stage, not because of what she had done, but because of who she was. When she finally blinked awake, the atmosphere had shifted. The hum of the plane no longer sounded safe, it sounded suffocating. Passengers whispered, some pointing discreetly, others not bothering to hide their unease. She straightened in her seat, confused, until she realized they were looking at her. Her chest tightened. Nothing had happened. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. And yet somehow, in the minds of those around her, she was already connected to danger. Her very presence had become suspect. The captain's words had stirred fear. But prejudice, simmering quietly below the surface, had already chosen its outlet. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to tell herself she was imagining it. But then came the first sharp whisper from across the aisle, too clear to ignore. "Why is she so calm?" Another voice followed. She was asleep the whole time, didn't even flinch. It was enough. Suspicion grew legs, weaving itself into the imagination of frightened passengers. Suddenly, her peace became evidence. Her quietness became guilt. Her heart pounded. She wanted to speak, to demand why they were staring, but fear clenched her throat. She had lived through moments like this before, on sidewalks, in stores, in offices. The stares, the assumptions, the unspoken accusation that she didn't belong. But never like this. Never thousands of feet in the air, trapped in a cabin with nowhere to run. The whispers became louder, sharper, feeding on each other. She could feel the heat of eyes pressing against her skin. Each second stretched painfully, and then came the first direct confrontation. A man a few rows ahead half-turned, his voice low but pointed. "She's not nervous at all. Doesn't that seem strange to you?" Strange. Dangerous. Different. The words didn't need to be spoken outright, everyone understood the insinuation. The flight attendant, sensing unrest, moved quickly down the aisle. But instead of calming the crowd, her presence only added to the tension. She paused by the woman's seat, her smile strained, her voice low. "Ma'am, I need to ask, are you feeling okay? Is everything all right?" The question was loaded, weighted with meaning. To anyone else, it might have sounded like concern. But to her, it was clear, they think I'm the problem. Her stomach dropped. A simple question, yet it felt like an accusation. Her response, measured, careful, would determine how this moment unfolded. She nodded quickly, forcing steadiness into her voice. "I'm fine. Just tired." The attendant studied her a moment longer, then offered a tight smile and moved on. But the damage was already done. The passengers had seen the scrutiny. They had seen her singled out. And in their fearful minds, that was confirmation. The whispers turned to murmurs. The murmurs to open suspicion. Every second she sat there, she felt the walls of the cabin closing in. She was no longer just a passenger, she was the subject of silent trial, judged not by her actions, but by her skin, her face, her presence. Her heart raced as she glanced around. Every glance back at her was sharp, filled with unspoken questions. She could almost hear them. Is she hiding something? Why her? Could she be dangerous? And then, just when she thought the tension couldn't thicken further, the captain's voice returned. This time, sharper. More urgent. "If there is anyone with military training, please, this is critical. We need your help." Panic surged through the cabin. A woman clutched her child closer. A man muttered a prayer under his breath. The fear was no longer abstract, it was real, suffocating. And in that fear, all eyes snapped back to her. One passenger, emboldened by terror, finally voiced what many were thinking. "Why don't you ask her?" he said loudly, gesturing toward her seat. The cabin froze. Her blood ran cold. The flight attendant hesitated, her expression torn between professionalism and the weight of dozens of expectant stares. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she returned to the woman's row. This time, there was no smile. Only suspicion. "Ma'am," she said firmly, "the captain needs to know if you have any relevant training. Is there something you should tell us?" Her breath caught. The question hung heavy in the air, a trap disguised as inquiry. How could she answer? To deny was to seem defensive. To question was to risk hostility. To say nothing at all was to confirm their fears. Every option twisted against her. She shook her head quickly. "No. I'm just a passenger." But the words didn't soothe the crowd. Instead, they deepened the silence, made her denial sound like evasion. The man who had spoken earlier scoffed loudly, his voice carrying. Convenient. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The cabin no longer felt like a plane, it felt like a courtroom, and she was the accused. Fear prickled across her skin. She thought of every headline, every story of people like her being mistaken, accused, targeted for nothing more than existing in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong color skin. And now, she was living it. She looked toward the window, the endless sky stretching outside, and realized the chilling truth: there was no escape. No way out. Whatever happened next, she was trapped in it. And the worst part? The moment hadn't even reached its peak. Because the real storm was still coming. The cabin, once a hum of quiet chatter and restless sighs, now throbbed with panic. The captain's words still hung heavy in the air, unanswered, echoing like an alarm that refused to be silenced. Fear had no patience, no logic, it needed someone to blame. And slowly, dangerously, it had chosen her. Her hands gripped the armrests, knuckles whitening. She had done nothing but exist in her own skin, in her own seat, on a plane like any other passenger. Yet the whispers had become accusations. The stares had sharpened into knives. And now, she felt the full weight of being the scapegoat for everyone's terror. A man in the aisle stood abruptly, pointing straight at her. Why her? Why hasn't she said anything? His voice cut through the cabin like a blade, feeding the fire. The flight attendant flinched but didn't silence him. Instead, she looked down at the woman again, her composure slipping. "Ma'am," she said louder this time, for all to hear, "the captain insists on clarity. Do you have any connection to the military? Any training? Anything at all?" The cabin leaned in. Dozens of eyes, wide and fearful, drilled into her. She could hear her pulse in her ears, feel her chest tightening. She wanted to scream, "I am just like you. I am here to fly, to arrive, to live." But her voice cracked when she finally spoke. "No. I told you, I don't." Silence. For a moment, it seemed her denial might settle the storm. But fear is not so easily calmed. A woman across the aisle pulled her child closer, glaring. Another passenger hissed under his breath, "She's lying." And then it happened. A second announcement from the captain, sharper, panicked. "This is urgent. We need immediate assistance. Anyone with fighter pilot experience, identify yourself now." The tension snapped. A man lunged from his seat 2 rows ahead, spinning to face the passengers. His voice boomed. "We can't just sit here. What if she's hiding something?" He pointed again, his finger trembling with both fear and accusation. "Look at her. Calm, quiet, like she's waiting for something." The words ignited chaos. Passengers gasped, muttered, argued. Suspicion turned into frenzy. She froze, her body rigid. It didn't matter that none of it was true. It didn't matter that she had no answers, no connection to the captain's cryptic plea. The cabin had already made its judgment. And in their fear, judgment was enough. A hand clamped down on her shoulder. She jerked, heart hammering, as one of the flight attendants leaned in. This time there was no pretense of politeness. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me." Her throat went dry. "Why?" "For everyone's safety. Everyone's safety." The word stung, slicing deeper than any accusation. She was no longer a passenger, she was the threat. The cabin stirred as she was pulled to her feet. Eyes burned into her, some angry, some terrified, none compassionate. Her legs felt weak, but she forced them to move down the aisle, guided by the attendant's firm grip. Each step felt like walking through fire, branded by every hateful glance. Someone muttered, "I knew it." Another whispered, "This is how it starts." She wanted to vanish, to melt into the floor, to escape the prison of their stares. But the aisle stretched endlessly, every second dragging her deeper into humiliation. At the front, she was stopped just outside the cockpit door. The attendant's hand still on her arm, she waited, trembling, as the captain's voice came faintly from the other side. "Ask her again." Her chest tightened. Again? How many times must she prove her innocence? "Ma'am," the attendant said flatly, "the captain wants to know if you've been trained, military, tactical, anything." Her voice cracked. "I told you, I haven't. I'm just here to fly." The attendant studied her, suspicion heavy in her eyes. Then she turned toward the door, murmuring something she couldn't hear. Inside, muffled voices argued. Seconds felt like hours. And then, without warning, the door opened a crack. The captain's face appeared, strained, pale, dripping with sweat. His eyes scanned her with a sharpness that made her flinch. "You." His voice was cold, direct. "Are you telling me the truth?" Her lips trembled. "Yes." The captain's jaw tightened, doubt flickering in his eyes. Then, suddenly, he shook his head and slammed the door shut. The sound reverberated through her, final and cruel. She was shoved backward by the attendant, back toward the galley where 2 other crew members waited. "Sit," one ordered. "Stay here until we sort this out." It wasn't a request. It was confinement. Her knees buckled as she sank into the hard jump seat, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The door to the cockpit remained sealed, a barrier not just of metal but of trust, trust she had never been granted, trust ripped from her before she even had the chance to earn it. The passengers craned their necks, watching. Some whispered furiously, convinced she was the cause of everything. Others avoided her gaze entirely, as though even looking at her might invite danger. The plane was still in the air. The engines still roared. But for her, the world had collapsed into this suffocating corner at the front of the cabin. Minutes stretched endlessly. Each tick of time carved deeper into her soul. She wasn't just being questioned, she was being erased. Stripped of her dignity, her humanity, her place among them. And then came the breaking point. A man approached from the passenger rows, anger radiating off him. "You're putting us all at risk," he spat. "If you know something, say it now." Her eyes widened. "I don't. Don't lie." He stepped closer, fists clenched, his voice shaking with rage. "I've seen people like you before. Always hiding. Always pretending. Not this time." The crew tried to stop him, but his words had already poisoned the air. Gasps erupted. A child cried. Fear turned into fury, and fury needed a target. She was that target. Tears burned in her eyes as she looked around, desperate for someone, anyone, to defend her. But no one did. Not one voice rose in her defense. Her chest heaved, her breath shallow, her mind screaming. How had it come to this? How had she gone from a woman seeking peace to an accused threat, stripped of protection, condemned without cause? And then, in that crushing silence, she realized the cruel truth. It wasn't just about this flight. It was about centuries of suspicion, of fear, of prejudice that had long marked bodies like hers as dangerous before they even spoke. She was living the weight of history, carrying the burden of every unjust suspicion, every false accusation, every stolen breath. The climax wasn't just in the shouts, or the stares, or the confinement. It was in the unbearable knowledge that nothing she said would matter. That in this moment, innocence had no voice. The cabin swirled with fear and fury. The engines roared louder. Her vision blurred with tears. And still, the captain's voice had the power to cut through it all. "Prepare for possible emergency procedures," he announced. The words dropped like stones into the silence. Emergency procedures. Passengers panicked. Chaos erupted. And in the chaos, all eyes turned back to her, as though she were the storm, as though she were the reason they might not survive. Her body trembled violently. Her lips moved, whispering prayers, desperate for strength. And as the plane hurtled forward into uncertainty, one thought burned in her mind, fierce and unrelenting. If this is how it ends, let the world see the truth. Let them see me, not as a threat, not as a shadow, but as a woman who deserved peace. But would anyone remember her that way? Or would she become just another name in a long list of stories America tried to forget? The engines screamed. The passengers shouted. The world tilted into chaos. And at the center of it all, she sat trapped, broken, and burning with a single unanswered question. Would she survive this flight? The chaos in the cabin did not last forever. Fear, like fire, eventually burns itself down to embers. Passengers who had shouted fell silent. Those who had accused now sat trembling in their seats, unwilling to meet her eyes. The captain never called for her again, never opened the door, never explained the urgency of his plea. Hours later, the plane landed safely. The threat that had sparked such panic, whatever it truly was, faded into silence, swallowed by secrecy. But the damage had been done. For her, there was no safety in that landing. When the doors opened and passengers rushed into the terminal, relief lit their faces. Relief that they had survived. Relief that the storm was behind them. But none of them looked back at her. None of them carried the shame of what they had done. That weight was hers alone. She stepped into the airport, her legs heavy, her chest still tight with the residue of fear. She had been accused without evidence, judged without cause, humiliated without reason. And though the flight was over, the memory clung to her like smoke that refuses to lift. In the days that followed, she replayed every moment in her mind. The whispers. The pointing fingers. The way her innocence had been treated as a lie, her calmness as guilt, her very existence as threat. She wondered if any of them even realized what they had done, or if, in their minds, it had simply been precaution. That word haunted her. Precaution. How many lives had been broken, how many futures destroyed, under the disguise of precaution? Because that's how racism often hides. Not in shouted slurs, not in burning crosses, but in the quiet cloak of safety, procedure, concern. It wraps itself in justifications, convinces itself it is rational. And yet the impact is the same. A life scarred. A soul diminished. A person left carrying pain that should never have been theirs. She did not tell many people what happened. Not because it wasn't important, but because she was tired. Tired of explaining, tired of reliving, tired of being told, maybe they didn't mean it like that. She knew what she felt. She knew the terror, the humiliation, the isolation. And she knew she wasn't alone. Because her story is not just her own. Every day, across cities, schools, workplaces, and yes, even airplanes, people of color are forced to live under suspicion. They are asked to explain themselves when no one else is questioned. They are watched more closely, doubted more quickly, punished more harshly. Their silence is read as guilt, their calmness as danger, their existence as something to be managed. This flight was just one story. But it is part of a much larger pattern, a pattern that stretches back generations, across borders, into every corner of life. A pattern where fear chooses its scapegoat, and prejudice finds its proof not in actions, but in skin. And what is left behind? The world moves on. The plane lands. The passengers go home. The incident is forgotten. But not by her. Not by those who live with the weight of being seen as other. They carry it forward, the sleepless nights, the sudden jolts of memory, the quiet realization that safety is never promised. That is the true cost of racism. Not just the public violence we see on headlines, but the private wounds that rarely make the news. The humiliation that lingers long after the moment has passed. The trust that is stolen. The peace that is never returned. She will move on, yes. She will continue her life. But she will never step on a plane the same way again. Never close her eyes in peace without wondering if this time, someone will decide she looks too calm, too quiet, too dangerous. And isn't that the tragedy? That even in the most ordinary moments, boarding a flight, taking a walk, buying groceries, racism can twist the ordinary into trauma. So we must ask ourselves, how many more times? How many more stories like hers will unfold in silence? How many more innocent lives will be shadowed by suspicion? How many more people will be forced to prove, again and again, that they are not the threat we imagine them to be? Because the truth is this, racism doesn't just live in laws or headlines. It lives in our choices, our glances, our silences. It lives in the way we respond when fear whispers in our ear. It lives in whether we question our prejudice, or let it question someone's humanity. Her story should never have happened. But it did. And it will happen again, unless we decide otherwise. So the question is not whether you were on that plane. The question is whether you will remember her story the next time fear comes looking for a scapegoat. Will you let suspicion turn into judgment? Will you let silence excuse injustice? Or will you be the one voice that says, enough? Not this time. Because change doesn't begin with grand speeches or historic laws. It begins in moments like these, when fear rises, and we choose whether to feed it or to stand against it. She was not a fighter pilot. She was not a threat. She was a woman who wanted peace, who deserved peace, but was denied it by a world still chained to its fears. And now, her story is in your hands. What will you do with it?